The morning my wife carried my belongings onto the driveway like they were garbage was the same morning 10 black SUVs turned onto Marlowe Street and stopped the world she thought she controlled. And through all of it, every insult, every performance, every neighbor watching behind a cracked curtain, she still had no idea that the man she called nothing had quietly built everything. The autumn sun was generous that Saturday, the kind of warm, golden light that makes a suburban street look almost beautiful. It made what happened next feel stranger, sharper. The way disaster always feels worse when the weather refuses to cooperate with the mood. The first suitcase hit the driveway hard. Red fabric. Split seam. My jeans and shirt spilling across the cracked concrete like the contents of a life being audited and found insufficient. Neighbors noticed before I could process what was happening. A man washing his truck 2 houses down went still. A woman pushing a stroller on the opposite sidewalk slowed without stopping. Because public humiliation is a magnet. It always has been. People don't slow down for success. They slow down for spectacle. Jessica stood at the top of the porch steps with her arms folded across her chest, and her jaw set in that particular way that meant the decision was already made, and the words were just ceremony. She wasn't speaking to me. She was speaking at me. Performing for the audience she'd always wanted. Every sentence she delivered was constructed to reduce me. She said I was going nowhere. She said she was tired of carrying the weight of a man who couldn't carry himself. She said she deserved more than what I was offering. She said she'd waited long enough for me to become someone worth standing beside. The words were cruel, but they were not unfamiliar. Contempt doesn't arrive suddenly. It builds in whispers, in the rolled eyes at dinner, in the sighs when another neighbor mentions a vacation, in the silences that stretch just a second too long after someone asks what you do for a living. By the time it arrives in a driveway on a Saturday morning, it has already been living in the house for months. My watch came flying out next. Then the cardboard box, tipping forward, spilling papers, photographs, a folded program from a conference she had never asked about. A picture from our first anniversary landed face up on the grass near the mailbox, catching the light. Jessica stepped off the porch and walked toward the pile, and with one deliberate motion kicked the nearest box further down the driveway. The sound of it skidding across the concrete carried the full length of the street. She told the neighbors I hadn't paid a bill in months. She told them she'd been propping up a man too proud to admit he was failing. She told them she deserved a man who showed up. Not one who disappeared on mysterious so-called business trips and came home with nothing to show for it. She gestured toward the street and told me to start walking before she made the call that would make me walk faster. I didn't move. I stood in the driveway in my red t-shirt and worn jeans with my hands loose at my sides, the way a man stands when there is nowhere he needs to rush to because everything he needs is already in motion somewhere else. My stillness irritated her more than any argument could have. She had prepared for a fight. She had rehearsed for tears or rage or pleading. What she encountered instead was a man who simply would not perform. Stillness unsettles people who expect chaos. 3 houses down, a man gave up pretending to rake leaves. Across the street, 2 women stood together on a driveway, no longer making any effort to appear disinterested. Jessica fed on the attention. She had wanted an audience, and Marlowe Street had delivered one. She stepped closer, finger extended toward the end of the driveway, and delivered the sentence she had clearly been saving. The one meant to be final, to be remembered, to close the door on any version of me she might have once believed in. She told me I would always be nothing. She said it once, loudly, for the street. And that was the moment things changed. Not immediately, not with drama. It began as a sound, low, disciplined, the kind of organized mechanical hum that doesn't announce itself so much as arrive. The neighbors heard it before they saw it. Heads turned toward the far end of Marlowe Street. The woman with the stroller stopped entirely. The man who had been raking leaves put the rake down without thinking about it. Jessica frowned, not yet afraid, just annoyed that something was stealing her moment. Then they came around the corner. 10 black Cadillac Escalades in perfect single-file formation, moving at a pace that communicated something beyond transportation. Not fast, not slow, deliberate. Polished hoods catching the autumn light like mirrors. Tinted windows, not a single gap in the formation. The convoy moved down Marlowe Street the way authority moves, without asking for permission and without needing to explain itself. One by one, they lined the curb in front of the house. The street went completely, absolutely silent. The neighbor stopped mid-word. Jessica's last sentence dissolved into the air unfinished. Even the wind seemed to hold. Engines idled in low unison, the only sound on the block. Then the lead door opened. A tall man stepped out in a charcoal suit that had not come off a rack. White gloves. Posture so composed it read as a credential. He scanned the driveway, the scattered shirts, the tipped boxes, the split suitcase, and registered none of it. His eyes found me immediately. He crossed the driveway with measured steps, moving past the debris of my marriage as though it were furniture he had no reason to acknowledge. He stopped 2 feet in front of me, adjusted his stance, and inclined his head. Mr. Callahan. 2 words, quiet as a contract being signed. He gestured once, briefly, toward the convoy behind him. The board convenes in 90 minutes. We should move. The neighbor across the street put her hand over her mouth. Jessica took 1 step backward without seeming to realize she'd done it. Her expression, the one that had been so certain, so rehearsed, so publicly committed, broke along a fault line she hadn't known existed. She looked at me, then at the suited man, then at the 10 vehicles lining her curb, then back at me. Behind the first SUV, doors were opening. Men and women in tailored clothing emerged with quiet efficiency. One moved directly to the scattered clothing and began folding each piece with deliberate care. Another lifted the tipped box and began replacing its contents. A third crouched near the mailbox and retrieved the photographs from the grass, handling each one as though it was significant. Because it was. My wife took another step back. Her arms had dropped from her chest. The performance was over. What replaced it was something rawer and less rehearsed. A woman watching a man she thought she had fully measured, revealing dimensions she had never once thought to look for. Her voice, when it finally came, was smaller than anything she had said all morning. "Reese, what is this?" I looked at her for a long moment. The same stillness, the same quiet. Then I buttoned my left cuff, nodded once to Marcus, and walked toward the convoy. I did not look back at the driveway. I did not need to. Everything worth taking was already on its way to the car. Everything worth leaving had already been left, piece by piece, over years, in a house on Marlowe Street that had held us both and understood neither of us. The door closed behind me. The convoy pulled away in the same disciplined formation it had arrived in, and Jessica stood alone on the cracked driveway in front of the neighbors she had performed for, surrounded by nothing, while somewhere across the city, a $32 billion vote was waiting on one signature. Mine. Jessica did not wake up one morning and decide to hate me. It happened the way most slow erosions happen, quietly, incrementally, one small disappointment stacked on top of another, until the pile became a conclusion she could no longer see past. In the beginning, she called my quietness depth. She told her mother I was the most grounded man she had ever met. She liked that I didn't chase things loudly, that I drove a simple truck and wore simple clothes and never needed a room to notice me when I walked into it. She said it felt like security. She said it felt like something real. I think she meant it, for a while. The truck was the first thing. A 7-year-old Chevy Silverado, dark gray, unremarkable in every way I had chosen it to be. Her neighbor Daniel bought a new BMW in the spring of our 2nd year, and something shifted in Jessica after the unveiling in his driveway. Some quiet internal accounting she never announced but never stopped running. She didn't ask me to buy a new vehicle. She was smarter than that. She simply began mentioning Daniel's car the way people mention things they want you to hear, casually, repeatedly, until the casualness itself becomes a message. I heard it. I just didn't answer it. The dinner parties came next. Marlowe Street had a rhythm to its social life. Backyard gatherings, holiday cookouts, the Hendersons' annual 4th of July setup that functioned less like a celebration and more like a quarterly review of everyone's financial progress. Jessica wanted to attend all of it. I attended some of it. When I declined, she went alone and came home quieter than she'd left, and the silence between us would stretch through the night until morning dissolved it. temporarily. She never understood why I avoided those evenings. The truth was simple and something I could not explain without explaining everything else. I had spent 20 years in rooms where power actually lived, and I had no appetite for rooms where people performed it. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from watching someone convince others they have arrived somewhere. I had arrived. I had no need to announce it over potato salad and craft beer on a Saturday evening. But to Jessica, my absence looked like shame. My restraint looked like limitation. My silence on the subject of money, the careful, deliberate, years-long silence I had maintained since before we met, looked like a man who had nothing worth saying. The work calls were the last thread she had patience for. I would disappear into the study for hours. International time zones don't accommodate suburban schedules, and some negotiations require the kind of sustained, uninterrupted focus that a household cannot provide. I would emerge at 10 at night to find dinner cold, and Jessica's expression colder, and I would offer what I could: proximity, presence, an apology for the disruption, and she would accept it the way someone accepts something they've stopped believing in. She stopped asking what the calls were about, somewhere in our third year. I thought, at the time, that it meant she had made peace with not knowing. What it actually meant was that she had made a decision about what the not knowing meant, and the decision was not generous. By the morning of that Saturday in October, Jessica had assembled years of evidence into a verdict so complete she no longer needed new information. She had her conclusion. The suitcase was already by the door before I came downstairs. The boxes were already stacked in the hallway. She hadn't decided to throw me out that morning. She had decided months ago. Saturday was just the sentencing. She had chosen a Saturday deliberately. I understood that the moment I stepped onto the porch and saw the suitcase already on the driveway below me, positioned where the neighbors could not miss it. A weekday would have been private. A Saturday morning on Marlowe Street was an audience. The autumn light was doing her no favors, and she didn't care. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed the choreography. Out the front door, down the porch steps, back inside, reappearing with a cardboard box balanced against her hip, depositing it beside the suitcase with a force that was theatrical without quite becoming uncontrolled. She had calibrated it. Enough violence to communicate contempt, not enough to lose the optics of a woman who had simply had enough. I stood near the door and watched her make the second trip. I did not move to help her. I did not move to stop her. I had made my own decision sometime in the long quiet hours before dawn, lying in the dark listening to her sleep, understanding that the marriage I had hoped for had not existed for a long time and that what remained was a performance waiting for its final act. She was ready to perform it. I would let her. The neighbors began to appear the way they always do, incrementally, plausibly, each one with a reason to be outside that had nothing to do with what was happening in front of my house. Curtis from 3 doors down materialized on his porch with a coffee mug he never raised to his lips. The Delgado sisters, who shared the house across the street, found simultaneous reasons to check their mailbox. The man in the blue house at the corner, whose name I had never learned in 4 years of living on the same block, simply stood at the edge of his driveway and watched without pretense. Jessica's voice lifted as the audience assembled, the way a performer's voice lifts when the house fills. She told the street I had given her nothing. She told the street she had carried us both and grown tired of the weight. She was not speaking to me at that point. I was simply the prop around which the monologue was constructed. She was speaking to Curtis and the Delgados and the nameless man in the blue house, delivering her accounting of our marriage with the conviction of someone who had been wronged so thoroughly that public testimony was the only proportionate response. My shirts came out of the second box in a cascade. A belt followed. The small cedar box where I kept my father's watch landed in the grass near the porch steps, and I tracked it with my eyes but did not move toward it. She stepped back and gestured at the pile, the open suitcase, the tipped boxes, the scatter of fabric across the cracked concrete, and presented it to the street like evidence. Here, she was saying, here is the full inventory of what I was given. Here is what he called a life. I looked at the house behind her, the white trim I had repainted 2 summers ago, the porch boards I had replaced that spring, choosing the right grade of wood with more care than she ever knew. The windows I had paid for, the roof I had paid for, the foundation beneath all of it that carried my name on documents she had never thought to read. I looked at it steadily, the way a man looks at something he is finished with but not ashamed of. Then I looked at her. She delivered the final line, the one meant to end me. And from somewhere at the far end of Marlowe Street, almost too low to identify at first, a sound began to rise. It started as a frequency more than a sound, something the body registers before the ears confirm it. A low, organized vibration rising from the end of the block with the patience of something that has never needed to hurry. Curtis heard it first. I watched his eyes move toward the corner before the rest of him followed. Then the Delgado sisters turned. Then the nameless man in the blue house shifted his weight and looked down the length of Marlowe Street with an expression that had moved beyond curiosity into something closer to instinct. Jessica was still speaking when the first escalade came around the corner. The words died in her throat the way sound dies in a room when the power cuts. Not gradually, but completely, all at once. What replaced them was something she had no prepared language for. They came in single file, 10 of them, identical in color and size, and the unhurried deliberateness of their pace, polished black hoods catching the autumn light and returning it without warmth, tinted glass that revealed nothing. They moved down Marlowe Street the way a sentence moves toward its period, with the quiet inevitability of something that has already been decided. Not fast, not slow. The pace of people who have never once needed to announce themselves and have long since stopped practicing. One by one they lined the curb. The street organized itself into absolute silence. Curtis's coffee mug lowered without him seeming to notice. The Delgado sisters stood shoulder to shoulder and did not speak. Somewhere behind me a screen door swung open and did not close. The convoy's engines idled in low unison, the only sound in the world for a long moment. And then even that seemed to soften as though the vehicles themselves understood the weight of what they had just walked into. The lead door opened. Marcus Webb did not look at the driveway. He did not look at the suitcase or the scattered boxes or the shirts across the concrete or the cedar box still resting in the grass near the porch steps. He stepped out of the vehicle with the contained efficiency of a man who had handled larger situations than this before breakfast, adjusted his cuff once and crossed the driveway with his eyes fixed on me from the first step to the last. He stopped, inclined his head. "Mr. Callahan, the board convenes in 80 minutes. That was all. No explanation offered to the street, no acknowledgement of the audience, no glance toward Jessica, who had not moved from her position on the driveway, who had, in fact, become as still as the neighbors she had been performing for 60 seconds earlier, as though the arrival had pressed a pause on everyone who was not me. I buttoned my left cuff, then my right. I did not look at the suitcase. I did not collect the cedar box from the grass, though I noted where it was and knew it would be handled. Behind Marcus, 2 members of the convoy team had already moved quietly onto the driveway, gathering, folding, lifting, with the careful precision of people who understood that every object belonging to me was worth treating as significant. They did not rush. They did not acknowledge the audience either. I looked at the house one final time, not with anger, not with grief, with the clean recognition of a man who has closed an account and is satisfied the arithmetic is correct. Then I nodded to Marcus and walked to the car. The door closed behind me with the soft, definitive sound of something sealed. The convoy pulled away in the same formation it had arrived in, unhurried, unified, absolute. Marlowe Street did not move for a long time after. The tower had no name on it. That was intentional. 43 stories of glass and reinforced steel rising above the financial district with the quiet confidence of something that does not require introduction. No brass lettering above the entrance, no corporate insignia on the exterior, no signage of any kind that would tell a passing stranger who occupied the building or what decisions had been made inside it. The people who needed to know already knew. Everyone else was not the intended audience. Marcus had a jacket waiting in the vehicle. I left it folded on the seat. I walked through the lobby of Callahan Capital in a red t-shirt and worn jeans, and the boots I had been wearing when Jessica told the street I would always be nothing. And not a single person in that building allowed their expression to register anything other than the standard professional composure they maintained, regardless of circumstance. The security team nodded. The elevator attendant pressed 52 without being asked. A junior associate, who had flown in from Singapore and had never met me in person, absorbed my appearance in one brief, careful glance and filed it away without comment. He would understand later. They always did. The 52nd floor was glass on 3 sides. On a clear autumn morning, the city spread in every direction. Highways threading through neighborhoods, towers clustered downtown, the distant silver line of the river catching the light at the edge of everything. From up here, Marlowe Street was somewhere in the middle distance, indistinguishable from 10,000 other residential blocks, which was precisely what I had always valued about it. The room was full. 12 executives around the primary table, 4 from our side, 3 representing the European acquiring partners, 2 from the legal consortium, and the remaining seats occupied by advisors whose presence signaled the seriousness of the number on the table. Interpreters positioned near the window. A separate delegation from the Seoul office visible through the glass conference wall, connected by screen. Documents aligned with geometric precision at each seat. Water poured, jackets on. The particular stillness of a room where everyone present understands that the next 90 minutes will move significant amounts of the world's capital from one configuration into another. I took my chair at the head of the table. Nobody mentioned the t-shirt. The lead counsel, a composed woman named Patricia Hines, who had been structuring deals of this magnitude for 2 decades, opened the session with the clean efficiency she was known for. $32 billion in cross-border acquisition. 4 years of negotiation compressed into a final vote. The documents had been reviewed, the terms ratified in principle, the regulatory pathway cleared in 3 jurisdictions. What remained was the formality of commitment, the moment when agreement becomes architecture. She walked the room through the final terms in 12 minutes. Questions were fielded in 2 languages. A minor clarification on the revenue threshold language was resolved in 4 minutes by the legal team without drama. Then Patricia looked down the table at me. I had been listening with my hands folded on the surface in front of me, the same stillness I had maintained on a cracked driveway 40 minutes earlier, in a different world that belonged to a different version of the morning. I said one word: approved. The vote moved around the table and came back unanimous. I signed where indicated, initialed twice, passed the documents left, and that was that. $32 billion finding its new shape in the world, quietly, in a room without a name on the door. Afterward, when the room emptied and Marcus dimmed the lights at my signal, I loosened my watch and set it on the table and stood at the window alone. The city offered itself in every direction, patient, enormous, indifferent to the morning I'd had. I didn't think about winning. I thought about the quiet life I had genuinely loved. The Saturday mornings, the old truck, the way the porch looked in early autumn when the light came through the maple at the property line and made everything on Marlowe Street look like it was worth something. I thought about how much of that had been real and how little of it remained. Curtis posted the video before the last SUV had cleared the end of the block. He had filmed the entire arrival on his phone from the edge of his porch, 10 seconds of shaky establishment, then steadying as instinct gave way to intention, capturing the convoy's approach, the doors opening, Marcus crossing the driveway, the 2-word exchange that nobody on the street could hear but everyone could feel the weight of. He had posted it to a local neighborhood forum with a caption that asked if anyone knew what was happening on their street. Within the hour, the forum post had been shared beyond the neighborhood. By early afternoon, it had found its way onto 3 separate social media platforms with new captions attached by strangers who had no context but strong opinions. By 4 o'clock, the original clip had accumulated enough views that the algorithms began doing the work themselves, pushing it outward in concentric rings, feeding it to people who watched adjacent content, multiplying its reach without anyone asking them to. The comments arrived in a particular sequence that revealed how people process what they cannot immediately explain. First came the questions. Then the theories. Then, as the clip sharpened from novelty into something more deliberate feeling, the recognition. A journalist named David Park, who covered private capital markets for a financial publication with a readership that existed several floors above the general public's awareness, recognized the plate configuration on the lead vehicle. He had seen that convoy once before, outside a Manhattan hotel during a summit 2 years prior, a detail he had filed in the meticulous way journalists file things they cannot yet use. He cross-referenced it in 40 minutes and published a short piece by mid-afternoon connecting the vehicles to Callahan Capital, identifying the company's structure, its reach, and the name of the man at its center. He did not have the full picture. He had enough. The piece was read on Marlowe Street before dinner. Jessica's sister called first. Her voice carried the particular frequency of someone performing concern while actually transmitting alarm, asking if Jessica was okay, asking what had happened, asking questions whose answers she already suspected and wanted confirmed so she could begin revising her own position on the morning's events. Jessica answered as little as the conversation allowed and ended the call before it reached the part where her sister would have to decide whether to be honest. Her mother called 11 minutes later and was not as careful with the transition. She had seen the article. She had seen the video. She wanted to understand, she said, what exactly had occurred. And the word exactly carried the full weight of a woman who had formed a judgment and was presenting it as a question. Jessica's closest friend, Mara, who 4 days earlier had sat across from her at a coffee shop and told her that she was finally doing the right thing, that she had given the marriage more than enough of herself, that she deserved someone who showed up visibly and loudly, did not call at all. Her last message, sent that morning before the video existed, remained the final entry in the thread. Jessica checked it twice. The silence was its own kind of answer. By nightfall, she was alone in the house, sitting in the living room with the television on but not watching it, until the financial news segment assembled itself in front of her, and the ticker scrolled his name across the bottom of the screen adjacent to a number she had to read 3 times before it organized itself into meaning in her mind. $32 billion. She sat with that number in the quiet house on Marlowe Street. The house that was, she now understood, never really hers to perform in, and felt the full weight of what she had done arrive not as a single blow but as a tide, wave after wave, each one carrying a memory she was only now equipped to read correctly. The silence he had maintained for years, the calls she had never asked about, the life she had measured and found insufficient without once asking what was underneath the floor she was standing on. The tide kept coming. She did not move for a long time. She had dressed carefully. That was the first thing I noticed when Marcus called up from the lobby to tell me she was there. Not that she had come, which I had expected, but that she had taken time with her appearance before coming, which told me something about what she believed she was walking into. I told him to send her up. The penthouse was not designed to impress. It was designed to function. Clean lines, substantial furniture, books on actual shelves, a view of the city that existed because the floor was high rather than because anything had been arranged to maximize it. There was no art selected for its price, no surfaces maintained for their effect on visitors. It looked like a place where someone lived and worked and thought, which is exactly what it was, and I had always preferred it to every more deliberate space I could have chosen. She stepped out of the elevator and took the room in the way people take in something that contradicts their expectations. Carefully, without letting the contradiction fully reach her face, she had imagined something louder. Wealth in her architecture of it announced itself with more insistence than this. She looked composed. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when she said my name, was measured in the way that voices are measured when significant effort is being applied to keeping them that way. I gestured to the sitting area, and she took the chair across from the sofa where I settled, and for a moment neither of us filled the air with anything. Then she began. She offered the explanations first. The pressure she had been under, the loneliness she had felt, the way my silence had created a vacuum that her insecurities had moved into and furnished. There was truth in some of it. I did not interrupt. She moved from explanation into apology with the careful transition of someone who had rehearsed the sequence, telling me she knew how the morning had looked, that she had let frustration become cruelty, that she regretted the audience she had chosen for what should have been a private conversation. The apology was genuine enough. Pain tends to produce genuine apologies once the performance has exhausted itself. Then she reached the part she had come for. She said she wanted to try again. She said she understood things now that she hadn't understood before. She said she had been measuring the wrong things and she knew that now, and she believed, she used that word deliberately, believed, that she could be different in possession of what she now knew. I listened to all of it with my hands folded and my eyes on hers, the same stillness she had spent years misreading as absence. When she finished, I let the quiet sit for a moment, not to punish her, simply because what I was about to say deserved the space before it. I wanted one thing from this marriage, Jessica, for you to choose me without knowing what choosing me meant. I needed to know that the man in the red t-shirt was enough, not as a test, but as a life. You had years of that man, years to decide. I paused. You made your decision on the driveway. She looked at me for a long time. I think she was waiting for the coldness that would make it easier to argue with, the cruelty she could push back against. It didn't come. I was not angry with her. I was simply finished, and there is no clean response to a man who is finished, because finished is not a position that leaves room for negotiation. I told her my attorney would be in contact within the week. I told her the settlement would be fair, more than fair, and that fairness was not a gesture but a value I intended to maintain, regardless of what the morning had looked like. She left without a fight. I stood at the window after the elevator closed and understood, in the particular clarity that follows irreversible things, that her leaving without a fight was the saddest version of the ending available to us. Anger would have meant something still lived there. The quiet that followed her out meant we had both already grieved this, her without knowing it, me in the long hours before dawn on a Saturday morning that had been coming for longer than either of us had admitted. The city held its lights below the window, steady and indifferent. I stood there until they blurred slightly. Then I went back to work. The attorneys handled most of it, which was the cleanest way for everyone involved. Mine was a woman named Claire Ashworth who had structured dissolutions of far greater complexity than this one, and approached the work with the same precise, unsentimental efficiency that I valued in everyone I kept close. She did not ask me what had happened on the driveway. She did not need the narrative. She needed the parameters, which I gave her in a single meeting that lasted 22 minutes. Generous settlement, no contest on assets, expedited timeline, and a non-disclosure agreement that protected Jessica as much as it protected me, because I had no interest in the story living beyond the people who had already witnessed it. Claire looked at the settlement figure once and then looked at me. I told her the number was correct. She filed the following Monday. The only thing I handled personally was the meeting with Jessica's family. It was my request, not theirs. A distinction that I understood would confuse them and did not attempt to explain. Her father, a quietly dignified man named Robert who had built a modest contracting business over 30 years and had always treated me with a straightforward decency I respected, met me at a restaurant midway between his house and the city. He came alone, which told me Jessica had trusted him with the appointment and trusted his judgment with whatever came of it. He was preparing for a confrontation when he sat down. I could see it in the set of his shoulders, the careful composure of a man who loves his daughter and has organized himself to defend her, regardless of the cost to his own comfort. I didn't give him anything to push against. I told him I bore no resentment toward his family. I told him the settlement was structured to ensure Jessica's stability for as long as she needed it, not as leverage, not as a gesture designed to be spoken about, but because it was the right thing to do for someone I had once built a life with, regardless of how that life had ended. I told him she would be taken care of. He sat across from me and absorbed all of it in silence, and when I finished, he looked at me with an expression that contained several things at once: relief and grief and something that resembled, I thought, a form of shame that belonged to him rather than to anyone else at the table. He reached across and shook my hand. We did not discuss the driveway. There was no version of that conversation that would have served either of us, and we were both old enough to know it. I drove back to the city in the old Silverado, which I had kept out of sentiment and practicality in equal measure. The drive took 40 minutes. I spent most of it not thinking about anything in particular, which is the mind's way of processing what it isn't ready to name yet. The house on Marlowe Street sold in 11 days. The buyer was a young couple from out of state, which seemed appropriate, people without history in the rooms, who would fill them with their own. I signed the documents electronically and did not drive past the property again. The red t-shirt was in the second drawer of the mahogany dresser in the penthouse bedroom, washed and folded with the same care that had been applied to every item the convoy team retrieved from the driveway. I had not worn it again. I had not discarded it either. It remained there the way certain things remain, not as a wound, not as a trophy, but as a record. Evidence that a version of the life I had wanted had been real, had been worn and lived in, had existed on a quiet street in autumn light before the morning it was thrown into the open and revealed as something the world was apparently not finished with yet. I was moving forward. That was not in question. The question I sat with in the clean silence of a penthouse that had always known my name was simpler and harder than any acquisition I had ever structured. Whether moving forward and being whole were the same thing, or whether that answer was still somewhere ahead of me, waiting with the patience I had always admired in other things. 3 years is enough time for the world to forget almost anything. It is also enough time for a person to become, quietly and without announcement, someone worth becoming. Callahan Capital moved into sustainable infrastructure 18 months after the driveway. It was not a pivot born from sentiment or public pressure. It was a recognition I had been sitting with for some time, that the next significant chapter of capital deployment would belong to whoever understood earliest that the physical systems holding the world together were aging faster than anyone in power was willing to say out loud. Water treatment, grid modernization, freight rail corridors across secondary markets on 3 continents. The work was unglamorous and essential, and largely invisible to the kind of press that covered wealth as performance, which suited me precisely. We structured 7 major projects across 14 months. The returns were substantial. The coverage was minimal. I considered both outcomes equally satisfying. I drove myself to the farmers' market on Saturday mornings. This was not a philosophical statement. It was simply what I wanted to do with Saturday mornings, and for the first time in longer than I could accurately measure. What I wanted and what I did occupied the same space without friction. I bought vegetables from a man named Gerald who grew heirloom tomatoes on a family plot 40 minutes outside the city and had no interest in where his customers worked or what their names meant to anyone else. I drank coffee from a paper cup at a folding table near the east entrance. I wore a baseball cap and comfortable shoes and moved through the market at the pace of a man with nowhere urgent to be, because on Saturday mornings, I didn't. The scholarship program had been running for 2 years before anyone outside the administrative team knew my name was attached to it. It operated under a foundation title that referenced a geographic region rather than a person, which was intentional. 64 students in rural counties across 4 states receiving full funding for post-secondary education in fields the local economies actually needed: engineering, agricultural science, healthcare administration, infrastructure management. I reviewed the cohort reports quarterly and attended nothing publicly. One of the program's coordinators sent me a handwritten note after the first graduation ceremony, describing a young woman from a town of 800 people who had told the audience that the scholarship had given her permission to believe her life could be larger than her circumstances. I kept the note in the cedar box my father had left me, the one that had been retrieved from the grass on Marlowe Street and placed in the penthouse with everything else. Permission to believe your life could be larger than your circumstances. I understood that more specifically than the coordinator knew. Jessica, by most accounts I was not seeking but occasionally encountered, was doing the same kind of quiet rebuilding in a different register. She had left the social architecture of Marlowe Street entirely. Not fled it, but genuinely departed the way people depart from identities they finally recognize as borrowed. She was working for a nonprofit in the city that provided financial literacy education to single mothers navigating economic instability, helping women understand credit and savings and debt in the practical, immediate way that changes daily decisions rather than abstract futures. The work, by every indication, had reorganized something in her. The people who knew her from before and encountered her now used a word that surprised them when they heard themselves use it: genuine. She seemed, they said, genuine. I did not track her progress deliberately, but I noted it the way you note weather, not with investment, but with a residual awareness that the world continues to move even in the places you are no longer standing. 3 years is enough time for a wound to close without disappearing. Enough time to understand the difference between recovery and replacement. Enough time to arrive, one ordinary Saturday morning in a farmer's market, at the quiet and undramatic realization that you are no longer performing your life for anyone. Not for a neighborhood, not for a marriage, not even for the version of yourself that needed to prove something once. I was simply living it. For the first time in a long time, that was exactly enough. The summit was held in a glass conference center on the Chicago waterfront in the first week of November, when the lake wind comes in with a particular authority that reminds the city it is still, beneath everything, a place built at the edge of something vast and indifferent. I had agreed to sit on a panel about private capital's role in public infrastructure. It was the kind of engagement I accepted selectively and honored completely when I did. I saw the name tag before I saw her. A rectangular card at the table adjacent to the panel staging area, part of the roundtable configuration for the afternoon session on economic mobility programs. Jessica Callahan, and then, below it in smaller text, the name of the nonprofit. She had kept the name. I noted that without attaching anything to it and moved my eyes to the room. She was already looking at me when I turned. 3 years produced changes in a person that photographs don't fully capture. What I saw in her face was not the careful composure of the penthouse visit, constructed under pressure and applied like a coat of paint over something structural still shifting beneath. What I saw was settled. Not healed in the way that word is sometimes used to mean return to original condition, but integrated. She carried what had happened the way a landscape carries weather that has passed through it, shaped by it, without being defined by it. She crossed the room with the particular ease of someone who has decided in advance not to make anything harder than it needs to be. Reese, Jessica. We shook hands. It was neither warm nor cold. It was the handshake of two professionals who share a history that belongs to a chapter both have finished reading. She told me, without preamble, that one of the women in her program's current cohort had received funding from a rural scholarship foundation the previous year, had used it to complete a credentials program in financial counseling, and was now, full circle, a peer advisor in Jessica's organization. She described the woman briefly and precisely, the way people describe things that have actually moved them rather than things they are performing being moved by. She said she hadn't connected the foundation to me until she saw the panel roster 2 weeks ago. I told her the program had its own momentum now, that the coordinators ran it better than I had designed it. She smiled at that. A real one, brief and unperformed. That sounds like something you'd say. I told her the non-profit work suited her. I meant it without subtext and delivered it without any, and she received it the same way, as an honest observation between people who have earned the right to be honest with each other because they are no longer trying to be anything else. We spoke for perhaps 4 minutes. Then the session coordinator signaled the panel, and we returned to our respective tables, and the afternoon moved forward the way afternoons do when the significant thing has already quietly occurred. The convoy that evening was 2 cars. I had made that adjustment sometime in the 2nd year, not as a statement, simply as a recalibration toward what was actually necessary. Marcus rode in the first vehicle. I rode in the second, alone, watching Chicago resolve itself into a pattern of light and distance as we moved through the evening traffic toward the airport. I thought about the driveway. I allowed myself to think about it fully, the way you can afford to revisit something once it no longer has the power to alter your direction. The suitcase, the scattered shirts, the cedar box in the grass, Jessica's voice carrying down a suburban street toward a conclusion she had already written. I thought about the convoy arriving, the weight of that single word from Marcus, the way the street had gone silent as though the world itself had paused to recalibrate. I had survived that morning. That much had been clear within hours. But survival, I understood now, was not the thing. Survival was the floor, not the ceiling. What I had actually done, in the 3 years of Saturday mornings and infrastructure projects and scholarship cohorts and clean, honest work undertaken without an audience, was something quieter and more permanent than survival. I had been clarified. The noise of a marriage built on a misunderstanding, the performance of a neighborhood measuring itself against itself, the weight of a secret carried so long it had become structural. All of it had burned away in the particular heat of one October morning, and what remained was precisely what had always been there beneath it, needing only the removal of everything else to become visible. A man who knew what he was, what he valued, what he was building, and why. The city fell away behind the vehicle as we reached the expressway. Ahead, the darkness opened into the long American distance between one place and the next, patient and enormous, indifferent to the stories being told within it. I loosened my watch and set it on the seat beside me. Outside, the lights of Chicago organized themselves into something that looked, from a certain distance, like clarity. I had not just walked away from a driveway on Marlowe Street. I had walked toward the man sitting quietly in the back of 2 cars, needing nothing more than what he carried, going exactly where he intended. The road held steady beneath us. I watched the distance and felt, without drama and without announcement, completely at peace.